At precisely 6 in the morning of May 3rd, 1874, the earth swallowed 87 men. They were miners, husbands, and sons, descending into the deep black of the Cumberland Plateau, chasing a vein of coal they called the Widowmaker. Hours later, a tremor shook the surrounding hills, sealing the shaft in a tomb of rock and soil. The official report would speak of a routine collapse, a tragedy born from geological chance. But the 6 who clawed their way back to the surface told a different story. They spoke not of falling rock, but of something far older, waiting in the dark. They spoke of the buried camp. The official report arrived on his desk bound in black leather, its title embossed in severe gold lettering. Cumberland Coal, Iron Company, Internal Assessment of the May 3rd Incident. 1874. It felt less like a document and more like an epitaph, cold and unnervingly final. The pages within were a masterclass in clinical detachment, a symphony of geological jargon and passive voice that spoke of tectonic stressors, unforeseen fissures, and the regrettable but conclusive structural failure of the primary shaft at the Blackbriar Creek mine. It concluded, with the sterile authority of a death certificate, that the 81 miners remaining within the earth were irretrievably lost, their tombs sealed by 1,000,000 tons of Kentucky shale and sandstone. Rescue, the report stated, was not only impossible but would recklessly endanger any who might attempt it. The company's resident geologist, a certain Dr. Alistair Finch, had signed off on the findings with a flourish, his signature a neat and tidy seal on a mass grave. For Arthur Prescott, a man dispatched from the ordered world of the Department of the Interior in Washington, the report read like a carefully constructed fiction. His mandate was simple, a formality whispered to him by a superior who wanted the entire affair concluded with minimal fuss. Travel to the unforgiving hinterlands of the Cumberland Plateau, verify the company's assessment, and add the government's rubber stamp to the tragedy, allowing the nation to mourn and, more importantly, move on. Arthur was a man built from logic and steel, a former railroad engineer who understood the world through the unyielding laws of physics and stress tolerances. He believed in numbers, in blueprints, and in the tangible evidence one could hold in one's hand, not in the panicked whispers of frightened men or the convenient fatalism of a corporate ledger. Yet, as his train rattled south, leaving behind the clean lines and gaslit certainty of the capital, the very landscape seemed to conspire against his reason. The gentle, rolling hills of Virginia gave way to the deep, jagged wounds of the Appalachian Mountains, ancient and brooding behemoths that swallowed the sky and seemed to press down on the soul with a palpable weight. The air itself changed, growing thick with the scent of damp earth, coal smoke, and something else, something wild and untamed that clung to the back of the throat. When he finally arrived in Blackbriar Creek, the town felt like an open sore nestled in a dark fold of the earth, a place where the sun was a reluctant visitor. A perpetual haze of coal dust hung in the air, clinging to every surface and painting the world in shades of gray. The silence was the first thing that struck him as fundamentally wrong. It was not the quiet of peaceful mourning, but a heavy, suffocating blanket of dread. It was in the hollow-eyed stares of the company men who greeted him at the small, grimy station, their dark suits seeming strangely formal against the backdrop of raw wilderness. Their leader, the mine superintendent Silas Blackwood, was a tall, gaunt man whose face looked as if it were carved from the very coal his company extracted. He offered a firm, cold handshake and condolences that sounded rehearsed, the words falling from his lips like stones into a well. They escorted him to the company office, a starkly functional building that smelled of stale cigar smoke and oiled leather. There, they presented him with a copy of the very same report he had read in Washington, as if its physical presence in this place would lend it more weight. They spoke in low, measured tones, their sentences clipped and their gazes unnervingly steady. They were a collective entity, a wall of somber, practiced grief, and yet Arthur could not detect a single flicker of genuine sorrow in their eyes. They were watchful, their stillness like that of predators who have just fed, content, and wary. Arthur felt a deep-seated rot emanating from their calculated silence, a corruption that went far beyond mere corporate negligence. The official story was too clean, too simple for a tragedy of this magnitude. 81 men, erased from the world in an instant, and the company had an explanation, a geological survey, and a signed affidavit from their doctor of geology, all prepared and finalized within a week. How could they be so certain? How could any man condemn 81 souls to the earth with such unhesitating finality, sealing the shaft with timber and rock before the dust had even truly settled? What kind of tragedy is accepted without a single tear from those who presided over it? His tour of the town only deepened the chasm between the official report and the palpable reality of the disaster. He walked the muddy, rutted Main Street, a lone figure in a city suit, drawing gazes that quickly darted away. He saw the faces of the widows, etched with a grief so profound it seemed to have stolen the color from their eyes, but beneath the grief was a stark, animal terror. When he approached them, offering the government's condolences, they would shrink away, pulling their shawls tighter and murmuring phrases that were not for him, but for the listening hills. They spoke to the saints or to the shadows, but not to the man from Washington. Doors were quietly closed as he passed. Curtains were drawn. The town was a conspiracy of fear, its residents bound by an unspoken pact of silence. In the dim light of the town's only tavern, where he had hoped to glean some truth from a loosened tongue, the whispers died the moment he entered. The few patrons, gaunt men with coal dust permanently etched into the lines of their faces, would simply stare into their glasses, their shoulders hunched as if bearing an invisible weight. The fear here was different from the cold, watchful silence of the company men. It was older, more primal. It was the fear of a flock that knows a wolf is moving among them, but dares not name it. He made his way to the site of the collapse, a fresh, violent scar on the face of the mountain. The entrance to the main shaft was gone, replaced by a mountain of freshly turned earth and shattered rock, shored up by massive, newly hewn timbers that looked like the bones of a dead giant. A small, pathetic collection of wilting flowers and wooden crosses lay at the base of the rubble, a testament to the grief the town was not allowed to speak aloud. As Arthur stood there, studying the angle of the collapse and the nature of the debris, Silas Blackwood appeared at his side, his presence as silent and sudden as a shadow. He spoke of the mountain as if it were a living thing, a temperamental beast. "This ground is old," Blackwood said, his voice a low rumble. "It holds memories. Sometimes it shifts to make room for new ones." The statement was poetic, almost philosophical, but it struck Arthur as a veiled threat, a warning to leave the past buried. It was then, standing before that monument of corporate expediency, that Arthur knew his mandate was not to rubber stamp a report, but to excavate a truth that had been deliberately and violently buried. The neatly constructed tombstone of the official story was beginning to crack, and he could feel the cold draft of a much deeper, much darker cavern just beyond it. He had seen the list of the deceased, 81 names. But in his preliminary review back in Washington, a footnote in the initial Telegraph dispatch had mentioned the recovery of 6 survivors, 6 men who had somehow escaped before the final, catastrophic sealing of the shaft. In the polished, leather-bound report, these 6 men did not exist. They were not named. Their accounts were not recorded. They were a loose thread in a seamlessly woven shroud of lies, and Arthur Prescott knew, with the cold certainty of a man who trusts only in tangible things, that he had to pull on it. What had those 6 men seen in the final moments before the darkness took their brothers? And why was the Cumberland Coal Iron Company so desperate to pretend they were never there at all? Finding the 6 survivors was like trying to grasp smoke. In the town of Blackbriar Creek, they were ghosts, their names expunged from company ledgers and excised from the official narrative with surgical precision. When Arthur Prescott inquired after them, citing the initial telegraphs from the day of the disaster, he was met with a wall of practiced ignorance. Superintendent Blackwood, his face an unreadable mask of granite, claimed it was a communications error, a moment of chaos and confusion in the immediate aftermath. The town's mayor, a man whose pockets were so deep with company money he practically jingled when he walked, dismissed the notion as a cruel rumor, an insult to the memory of the dead. Even the local physician, a man who smelled faintly of whiskey and regret, would only shake his head, his eyes pleading with Arthur to let the matter rest, to not stir the stagnant, murky waters of the town's grief. But Arthur was a man who believed in the tangible, and 6 living, breathing men were not a rumor. He spent 2 days combing through preliminary rosters, through telegram receipts, and the hastily scrawled notes of the first responders, a task made nearly impossible by the deliberate obstruction of company officials who seemed to be everywhere at once, offering unhelpful assistance and steering him away from any document that predated the final, polished report. The breakthrough came not in an office, but in a small, clapboard church that sagged under the weight of the mountain's shadow. The preacher, a young, terrified man with eyes that had seen too much, initially offered the same tired platitudes. But Arthur, seeing the tremor in the man's hands as he clutched his Bible, did not press him about the disaster. Instead, he asked about the souls of the living, about the families who had lost everything. He spoke of the company's swiftness, its lack of sentiment, and in the preacher's guarded silence, he sensed an ally. Late that night, a slip of paper was pushed under his door at the boarding house, bearing 6 names and a crudely drawn map leading deep into the tangled woods, far from the company's watchful eyes. The names were common, unremarkable: Silas, Jebediah, Thomas, Caleb, Enoch, and Finn. The map, however, pointed toward a place the locals called the Devil's Jawbone, a jagged outcropping of rock in a hollow so deep it was said the sun never touched its floor. The journey was a descent into another world. The last vestiges of the town gave way to a labyrinth of ancient trees, their branches twisted into arthritic claws that clawed at the sky, blocking out the light. The air grew heavy and cool, thick with the smell of decay and wet leaves, a primordial soup of odors that felt older than the town, older than the mine itself. The path was barely a suggestion, a faint deer trail that snaked through treacherous ravines and over moss-slick stones. It was a landscape designed to keep secrets. He found them huddled in a dilapidated cabin, a structure that seemed to be slowly surrendering to the forest, its timbers rotted and its roof sagging like a broken back. A thin plume of smoke, barely visible against the gray sky, was the only sign of life. As he approached, the door creaked open, and a long-barreled rifle emerged, followed by the hard, suspicious face of a man whose youth had been scoured away, leaving behind only bone and beard and a terrifying vacancy in his eyes. This was Caleb. The other 5 emerged from the shadows of the cabin like wary animals, their bodies thin and wiry, their faces etched with a shared, unspeakable trauma. They were pariahs, exiles in their own land, their sanity publicly questioned and their testimony buried by the very people they had worked for. Arthur, the man from Washington in his clean suit and polished boots, was an intruder from a world that had already condemned them. He did not present his government credentials or speak of his official investigation. Instead, he held up the slip of paper with their names. "The preacher thought you ought to have a visitor," he said, his voice calm and even. For a long while, they only stared, a silent council of the damned. It was the oldest of them, Enoch, a man with a wild mane of white hair and eyes that burned with a feverish intensity, who finally spoke, his voice a dry rasp, thick with the cadence of the deep hills. "Ain't no visitors for us, only ghosts." Arthur met his gaze. "The company says there was a geological anomaly. They say the mountain shifted." A bitter, rattling sound that might have been a laugh escaped Caleb's throat. "The mountain shifted, aye, but it weren't the rock that took 'em." He lowered the rifle, though his suspicion remained palpable. They led him inside, into the cabin's single, dim room. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and unwashed bodies, the claustrophobic scent of fear. They sat on crude wooden stools, their bodies angled toward him, a jury of witnesses ready to deliver a verdict on his worthiness to hear their tale. Arthur simply waited, his stillness and his silence a stark contrast to the company's loud, declarative finality. He was not there to tell them what happened. He was there to listen. It was Enoch who finally began to speak, his words tumbling out at first, then settling into a slow, deliberate rhythm, the cadence of a man reliving every moment of a nightmare. He spoke not of a collapse, but of a discovery. They had been working the deepest seam, the one they called the Widowmaker for its treacherous nature, chasing a rich vein of coal that promised a handsome bonus. For weeks, the ground had been acting strangely. There were odd vibrations, not the familiar groans of a settling mine, but a deeper, more rhythmic tremor, almost like a slow heartbeat deep within the stone. Animals on the surface had grown skittish, and the canaries they took down into the shaft would fall silent for long stretches, their little bodies trembling for no apparent reason. On that final morning, Jebediah's pickaxe had broken through. It did not strike more coal, nor did it open into a pocket of gas. The tool simply punched through the rock face into empty space. The air that hissed out was not the stale, mineral-scented air of the mine. It was cold and carried a strange, organic smell, like a freshly opened grave or a butcher's cellar. There was a profound and unnatural silence from beyond the wall, a quiet that seemed to absorb the sounds of their own breathing. Curiosity, that most human and fatal of flaws, took hold. Against the foreman's better judgment, they widened the opening, their lamps pushing back the oppressive darkness to reveal a space that defied all logic. It was a cavern, but of a scale that dwarfed any cathedral built by man, a vast, subterranean world that stretched out into an impenetrable blackness. The ceiling was lost in the gloom, and the air was still and cold. Far below them, in the cavern's belly, they saw lights. It was not the steady, harsh glow of lanterns, but the flickering, primal dance of dozens, perhaps hundreds, of torches, casting long, wavering shadows that writhed like living things. As their eyes adjusted, they saw what the torches illuminated, a camp, a primitive settlement of crude huts built from black stone and what looked like the petrified bones of enormous, unidentifiable creatures. In the center of the encampment stood a great dark shape, a monolithic slab of what looked like polished coal, though it seemed to absorb the torchlight rather than reflect it. A low, rhythmic chanting, a sound that was more a vibration in the chest than a noise heard with the ears, drifted up from the darkness, a sound of profound and terrible antiquity. And then they saw the inhabitants. They moved between the huts and around the great monolith with a slow, deliberate purpose, their forms pale and ghostly in the flickering light. They were humanoid, but wrong in a way that scraped at the very edges of reason. Their limbs were too long, their movements too fluid, too silent. They were hairless, their skin the color of bleached bone, and their faces were devoid of any discernible expression. They were a clan, a collective, moving with the unified, unnerving purpose of insects in a hive. They did not seem to notice the new opening in their world, or if they did, they showed no surprise, no alarm. There was no sense of discovery, only of grim expectation. It was then that the rest of the 87 miners, drawn by the commotion, began to gather at the breach, their rough voices and hearty laughter echoing and then dying in the cavern's immense silence. A sense of awe and excitement rippled through the men. They had discovered a hidden world, a geological marvel. But Enoch and the other 5 felt a different emotion coiling in their guts, a primal, instinctual terror. The foreman, a good company man named Macready, decided they had to report the finding. He shouted down into the abyss, his voice sounding small and foolish in the vastness. There was no reply. The pale figures below simply stopped their movements and, as one, turned their blank faces upward toward the breach. The silence that followed was absolute. What happened next was not an act of aggression, but of methodical collection. As Enoch described it, a group of the pale inhabitants detached from the main body and began to move toward the wall beneath the miners, their movements unnaturally swift. They did not climb. They flowed up the rock face, their long limbs finding purchase where none should exist. Panic erupted among the miners, a cacophony of shouts and screams. They scrambled back, trying to flee into the familiar darkness of the shaft, but it was too late. The pale beings swarmed through the opening, their silence the most terrifying thing about them. They did not attack with rage or malice. Their actions were calm, efficient, and chillingly pragmatic. They moved among the terrified miners, not with weapons, but with their bare hands, their touch unnaturally cold, their strength immense. One of the miners, a large, powerful man named Big John, tried to fight back. He swung a pickaxe, a tool that could split rock, but one of the pale figures caught it mid-swing, its long white fingers closing around the hickory handle with casual, impossible strength. It simply took the axe from him, its face remaining a placid, empty mask. Enoch, Caleb, and the others had been at the back of the group, and they watched in frozen horror as their colleagues were not killed, but subdued, herded like livestock toward the opening. The foreman, Macready, screamed at them, demanding to know who they were, what they wanted. One of the pale beings, seemingly their leader, paused and looked at him. Its mouth opened and a voice emerged, a dry whispering sound like dead leaves skittering across stone, speaking a heavily distorted, archaic form of English. Enoch would never forget the words, for they were not a threat, but a statement of fact. "The earth gives the black stone," it whispered, "and we give the earth its due. It is the weighing of things. A tithe of flesh for a bounty of stone." The 81 miners were not victims of a disaster. They were a payment, a tax levied by something ancient and unspeakable. They were a harvest. It was in that moment of horrified understanding that the first tremor shook the mine, a deep, resonant groan that came not from the cavern, but from the shaft behind them. The company knew. The company had always known. The thought slammed into Enoch with the force of a physical blow. The mine was not just a mine, it was a feeding trough. The seismic anomaly was a lie, a trigger, a means of sealing the tomb and hiding the transaction. It was this realization that broke the paralysis of the 6. They did not run because of the pale things. They ran because they understood that the true monsters were the men on the surface, the men who had sent them down here knowing what waited in the deep. They scrambled back through the connecting tunnels as the world came down around them, the roar of collapsing rock and timber drowning out the screams of their friends. They did not know if they were being pursued. They only knew that they had to reach the sky. They clawed their way out through a secondary ventilation shaft, emerging into the gray morning light, just as the main entrance imploded, burying the 81 men and the horrifying truth along with them. When Enoch finished, the cabin was silent, save for the crackling of the fire and the ragged breathing of the 6 survivors. They were not madmen. Arthur looked at their haunted faces, at the absolute, unwavering conviction in their eyes, and he knew they were telling the truth as they had lived it. The man of logic and reason, the engineer who believed only in stress tolerances and geological surveys, was gone. In his place was a witness to a testimony that defied every law of the world he knew. He now understood the town's suffocating fear and the company's cold, efficient silence. It was not a cover-up of a tragedy. It was the quiet continuation of a horrifying, multi-generational contract. He had come to Kentucky to rubber stamp a report on a mining accident, but he had instead unearthed a history of human sacrifice. He looked at the 6 broken men, the only ones who had seen the truth and lived, and he knew that their impossible story was now his burden to carry. The 6 men's story had fractured Arthur Prescott's world, cracking the very foundations of logic and reason upon which he had built his life, and as he walked away from their wretched cabin in the deep woods, the sane world of sunlight and solid ground felt like a fragile illusion stretched thin over a chasm of impossible darkness. The survivor's words, thick with the dialect of the hills but sharp with the clarity of absolute terror, echoed in his mind not as the ravings of grief-stricken madmen, but as the testimony of witnesses to a truth so monstrous it had scoured their souls clean of all hope. He knew then that the leather-bound report on his desk was not just a lie but a blasphemy, a carefully constructed piece of fiction designed to conceal a history of ritualistic slaughter. To fight a fiction, he needed facts, not the fabricated geology of the Cumberland Coal Iron Company, but the cold, hard, and verifiable facts of history. And so he made his way to the Whitley County Courthouse, a severe brick building that stood as a lonely outpost of order against the encroaching wilderness. He sought the county archives, a place he imagined would be a repository of 100 years of births, deaths, deeds, and disputes, the mundane and tangible record of a community's life, but the room he was led to felt less like an office and more like a tomb. It was a cavern of paper, a subterranean vault in the courthouse basement where the air was cold and still, thick with the smell of decaying pulp and the faint, sweet scent of mold. Sunlight struggled through a pair of grimy, barred windows set high in the stone walls, casting long, dusty shafts of light that illuminated swirling motes of dust, the ghosts of forgotten documents. The archivist, a man so old and desiccated he seemed to have become one with the crumbling records he curated, looked at Arthur over a pair of thick spectacles with an air of profound indifference, his silence a part of the room's oppressive quiet. He pointed a trembling, ink-stained finger toward a wall of towering shelves laden with precariously stacked ledgers and boxes tied with faded twine, and then retreated to his desk, leaving Arthur to his excavation. He began with the tangible, the modern, tracing the lineage of the Cumberland Coal Iron Company backward from the present day. The incorporation papers, dated 1852, were straightforward, listing the founding board members: Silas Blackwood's grandfather, Jedediah Blackwood, as president; Dr. Alastair Finch's grandfather, the very same Dr. Ephraim Finch whose name had appeared on so many questionable death certificates, as the company physician and chief investor, and a handful of other names that echoed through the current power structure of the town. The deeds were a patchwork of land acquisitions, culminating in the purchase of a vast, undesirable tract of land that included the Blackbriar Creek Hollow and the mountain that loomed over it, a parcel of land that had been in the Blackwood family since the first settlers had pushed their way into these unforgiving hills. This was the surface layer, the respectable facade of commerce and industry, but Arthur knew the rot lay deeper. He pushed past the neat, organized records of the company and began to delve into the older, more chaotic annals of the county's history, into the time before the mine, before the town was anything more than a handful of scattered, isolated homesteads. He pulled down the oldest census records, the brittle pages cracking in his hands, their spidery cursive detailing the first families to claim this land in the late 1700s. And there it was, the root of the tree, Mordecai Blackwood, his name affixed to a land grant from 1791, claiming the entirety of the hollow and the surrounding ridges, the land described in the archaic survey notes, not by longitude and latitude, but by landmarks that spoke of a darker, more mythic world, referencing the shadow of the stone god and the creek that weeps. With the family's long tenure established, Arthur began the grim work of cross-referencing names with the county's earliest death records, a task that felt like a descent into the very earth itself. The official causes of death were a litany of frontier hardship: cholera, consumption, childbirth, snakebite. But as he focused his search on the area defined by the original Blackwood patent, a disturbing pattern began to emerge from the statistical noise, a steady, rhythmic cadence of unnatural death that beat like a hidden heart beneath the official history. He found the coroner's inquest for a family of German immigrants, the Schmidts, who had disappeared in 1805. Their wagon was found abandoned, its contents untouched, with the official conclusion being that they had wandered into the deep woods and were lost to the wilds, a tidy explanation that failed to account for the local sheriff's peculiar addendum that the oxen were found with their throats torn out, yet their carcasses were untouched by scavengers. He uncovered the file of a traveling preacher, lost in 1819, whose horse had returned to the nearest settlement alone, its eyes wild with terror, its flanks scored with marks that the local blacksmith swore were not from any known animal, but looked almost like the impressions of long, claw-like fingers. The preacher was never seen again, his disappearance attributed to an act of God, a convenient and unassailable final word. The most chilling discoveries were the coroner's reports themselves, penned in the early years by the same Dr. Ephraim Finch, who would later help found the coal company. His clinical observations were precise, yet beneath the medical jargon, Arthur sensed a cold, almost academic curiosity in the unnatural. He read the report on 3 surveyors from Lexington, whose mangled bodies were found at the bottom of a ravine in 1827. Finch meticulously documented the shattered bones consistent with a fall, yet he also noted, in a small, cramped script in the margins, the complete absence of blood at the scene, as if their bodies had been drained before they were cast into the ravine. It was a systemic culling disguised as a series of isolated misfortunes, a quiet, ongoing harvest of any outsiders who strayed too close to the Blackwoods Hollow. The number of missing travelers, lost hunters, and vanished prospectors was statistically impossible for such a sparsely populated area, a dark lineage of disappearances that stretched back decades before the first lump of coal was ever pulled from the ground. Frustrated by the cold, incomplete nature of the official records, Arthur began searching for something more personal, for a voice from the past that could give context to the chilling data. In a dusty, forgotten crate, he found what he was looking for, a small, leather-bound book, the personal diary of a circuit-riding Methodist minister named Reverend Thaddeus Kane, dated 1834. The Reverend had traveled these hills, bringing the gospel to the isolated homesteads, and his diary was filled with observations of the land and its people. His early entries spoke of the rugged beauty of the mountains, but as his circuit brought him closer to the Blackbriar Creek Hollow, his tone shifted from reverence to a deep, abiding fear. He wrote of the Blackwood clan, describing them not as pioneers, but as something else, something that had gone to ground and taken the darkness of the earth into their souls. He described them as unnaturally pale, silent, and watchful, a people who kept to themselves and regarded outsiders with a cold, predatory gaze. He wrote of the local folklore, the whispers he heard from other settlers who lived on the surrounding ridges, stories of the Hollow Folk or the Pale Clan, who were said to make offerings to the mountain itself, to a god of the deep places. The folklore, as recorded by the terrified Reverend, spoke of a pact made by the first Blackwood settler, a covenant with an ancient power that dwelt beneath the rock. In exchange for its protection and a guarantee that the land would always provide for them, the clan was to provide the entity with a tithe, a steady stream of life to sustain it. The Reverend dismissed it as pagan superstition, a devilish fantasy born of isolation and ignorance, yet his final entry was a scrawl of panicked, barely legible script. "They know I have been listening. Blackwood's eyes are on me. I saw them last night, moving in the trees without sound. They are not men. May God have mercy on my soul." There was no further entry, and Arthur knew he was reading the last words of another victim, another number in the long, bloody tally. It was all there, the entire monstrous truth, hidden in plain sight within the dry, dusty records of Whitley County. The Blackwood family and their closest allies, the Finches and the others, were the direct descendants of that original, isolated clan. They were the surface dwellers, the respectable face of a cult that had spanned generations. The founding of the Cumberland Coal, CAA, in Iron Company was not an act of industrial progress. It was an act of profane efficiency. They had industrialized their sacrificial rites. The bounty of stone the pale creature had spoken of to the miners was no longer the meager sustenance of a mountain farm. It was the black, profitable heart of the Industrial Revolution, coal. The mine was their temple, a modern, technologically advanced abattoir designed for the sole purpose of feeding the ancient, unspeakable thing that lived in the darkness below. The 81 miners were not the first offering, but they were, by far, the largest, a grand tithe to fuel a new era of prosperity for the clan. Sitting in the gloom of the archive, the lamplight casting his own long, distorted shadow on the wall, Arthur Prescott felt the weight of a century of death settle upon him. He had the history, he had the motive, he had the names, but he was holding a truth built from the whispers of ghosts, the annotations of a long-dead coroner, and the fearful scribblings of a murdered preacher. How could he possibly make the world of order and reason, the world of Washington and its leather-bound reports, believe in a family tree whose roots were fed by human blood and whose branches produced a fruit of pure, unadulterated evil? The truth Arthur Prescott now possessed was a venom for which there was no antidote. It had seeped into his bones, poisoning the well of his logic, and leaving him stranded in a waking nightmare where the laws of his world no longer applied. He could not simply present his findings a collection of whispers, folklore, and the desperate testimony of 6 broken men to the authorities in Washington. To do so would be to invite his own ruin, to be branded a madman, a fantasist undone by the grim atmosphere of the Appalachian Hills. Silas Blackwood and the Cumberland Coal, Iron Company, had constructed a fortress of lies so formidable and so deeply rooted in the community's fear that it could only be brought down by a truth that was tangible, undeniable, and horrific. He needed proof, something he could carry back out into the light, a piece of the darkness so irrefutable it would shatter their carefully crafted reality. The thought of re-entering that mountain, of willingly descending into the tomb that had claimed 81 souls, was a cold knot of dread in his stomach. But the alternative, to walk away and leave the truth buried, was a betrayal he could not contemplate. He needed a way in, a path that bypassed the sealed main shaft and the company's watchful eyes. And for that, he needed knowledge that was older than the mine, older than the town itself. His search led him not to an office or an archive, but to the final, fraying edge of the civilized world, to a small, isolated Cherokee settlement on the far side of the ridge, a place the townsfolk spoke of in hushed, superstitious tones. It was there he found an old woman named Yona, a woman whose face was a road map of a century of sorrows and whose eyes held the deep, quiet wisdom of the mountains themselves. He did not speak to her of mines or collapses. He spoke of the old stories, of the mountain that the locals called Black Briar, but that her people called Osaholyo, the heart of the hungry shadow. He spoke of the Pale Clan, and he saw a flicker of ancient, weary recognition in her eyes. She listened to his story without interruption, her silence a profound and weighty thing. When he was finished, she simply nodded, as if he had told her a tale she had known all her life. She told him of a path, a secret way into the mountain's belly, a place her ancestors had known and feared for generations. It was a narrow, treacherous fissure in the rock, a cave system that was not on any map, known to her people as Unegvwali Yi Gahu Stili, the throat of the mountain. It was a sacred and terrible place, one they had not entered for 100 years, for they knew what slept in the deep places of the earth. She warned him that to enter the throat was to be swallowed, that some truths were not meant for the living. But seeing the grim resolve in his eyes, she drew him a map on a piece of cured deerskin, its lines and symbols a language of rock and root and shadow. Arthur now had his path, but he could not walk it alone. He needed a team, however small, however desperate. His first recruit was a man he found drowning his ghosts in the bottom of a whiskey bottle in a tavern 2 counties over. Elias Vance had once been the most respected surveyor in the state, a man who could read the language of the land like a poet reads verse. But his career had been shattered when he had refused to sign off on the geological surveys for a new railroad line, citing instabilities in the rock that no one else could see. The railroad company, a powerful and ruthless entity, had branded him a drunk and a fraud, destroying his reputation and leaving him a broken man. Arthur, remembering the name from his own engineering days, saw not a disgrace, but a man of principle, a man who, like himself, had been crushed for daring to speak an inconvenient truth. He found Elias in a haze of cheap liquor and self-loathing, and he laid out the entire, insane story. Elias listened, his cynical, bloodshot eyes slowly clearing as Arthur spoke. The engineer in him, recognizing the chilling logic in the pattern of disappearances, the methodical precision of the accidents. When Arthur finished, Elias was silent for a long moment. Then he let out a long, shuddering breath, the first sober breath he seemed to have taken in years. "A tithe of flesh for a bounty of stone," he whispered, the phrase hanging in the stale air of the tavern like a death sentence. "It's the most elegant and horrifying piece of engineering I've ever heard of." He was in. The next 2 members of his desperate fellowship were harder to convince. He returned to the hidden cabin in the Devil's Jawbone, to the 6 haunted survivors. He told them of his plan, of the secret way into the mountain, of his need for men who knew the layout of the upper tunnels and who had seen the unspeakable things that lay in the deep cavern. 4 of them refused outright, their terror a wall he could not breach. They had escaped the belly of the beast once. To willingly return was a form of suicide they could not contemplate. But 2 of them, Caleb, the hard-faced man with the rifle, and the old man, Enoch, whose eyes burned with a feverish need for vengeance, felt a different pull. Their survival had not been a blessing, but a curse, leaving them stranded between the world of the living and the world of the dead, haunted by the ghosts of their 81 friends. For them, confronting the horror was not a choice, but the only possible path to reclaiming some piece of their shattered souls. "We left 'em in there," Caleb said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "Can't live with that. Better to die with them than live with that." Enoch simply nodded, his gaze fixed on some distant, terrible memory. And so the fellowship was formed. A disgraced government man, a drunkard surveyor, and 2 ghosts who walked the earth. They gathered under the cloak of a moonless night, their supplies meager, coils of rope, pickaxes, lanterns, and the deerskin map. They moved like wraiths through the sleeping town and into the oppressive blackness of the forest, the silence of the ancient woods, a stark contrast to the hammering of their own hearts. The entrance to the throat of the mountain was exactly as Yonah had described it, a jagged, black wound in the side of a moss-covered cliff face, hidden behind a curtain of tangled, thorny vines. The air that breathed from it was ancient and cold, carrying the scent of wet stone, of deep, undisturbed earth, and something else, a faint, metallic tang that tickled the back of the throat, the coppery scent of old blood. The descent began. The narrative pace slowed to a crawl, each footstep, each ragged breath echoing in the profound and claustrophobic silence. The passage was narrow, forcing them to move in single file, their shoulders scraping against the cold, damp rock. The beams of their lanterns cut feeble cones of light into a darkness that felt solid, a physical presence that pressed in on them from all sides. Elias, his surveyor's instincts reawakened, took the lead, his hands constantly tracing the contours of the rock, his mind mapping their descent into the earth's gullet. The initial passage was a natural fissure, but after 100 yards, it began to change. The walls grew smoother, the floor more even. They were no longer in a natural cave, but a tunnel, ancient and man-made, though by what manner of man they could not guess. The air grew colder, and the silence deepened, broken only by the drip, drip, drip of water seeping through the rock, a sound like a maddeningly slow clock ticking down to some awful revelation. It was Caleb who saw them first. He stopped, holding his lantern close to the wall, his breath catching in his throat. Etched into the stone were symbols, sigils of a kind Arthur had never seen before. They were not the pictograms of the native tribes, nor were they any recognizable form of writing. They were complex, geometric patterns that seemed to shift and writhe in the flickering lantern light, designs that spoke of a cold, alien intelligence. As they moved deeper, the sigils became more frequent, more elaborate, covering the walls in a silent, screaming tapestry of unknown meaning. They were a warning, a territorial marking, a declaration of sovereignty by the things that dwelt in the deep. The smell of old blood grew stronger, and the oppressive silence began to be punctuated by a new sound, a faint, almost subliminal hum that seemed to vibrate up through the soles of their boots, a deep, resonant thrumming like some colossal piece of machinery or a monstrous, sleeping heart. Hours bled into one another. Time lost its meaning in the unchanging darkness. They were in a labyrinth, a place outside the known world, their only guide the deerskin map and Elias's uncanny sense of direction. He navigated them through a maze of intersecting tunnels, some of which ended in sheer drops into blackness, others in collapsed rubble. He seemed to be reading the rock itself, sensing the subtle shifts in the stone that told him which way to go. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of descent, Elias stopped. He pointed his lantern at the floor. There, unmistakable in the damp soil, were tracks. They were not the boot prints of miners, but the long, bare, three-toed tracks of something not quite human. They were fresh. They were not alone in the darkness. The hum grew louder, the air thicker, the coppery stench more pronounced. They were close. Enoch, who had been unnaturally silent for the entire journey, began to whisper, his voice a dry, rattling hiss. He spoke of the 81, of their faces in the final moments, of the chilling, pragmatic silence of the pale things as they collected their tithe. His words were a litany of horror, a soundtrack to their descent. They came to a final, low-ceiling tunnel, and Elias held up a hand, signaling for them to douse their lanterns. From the darkness ahead, they could see a faint, flickering orange glow, and they could hear it now, the sound that had been a vibration in their bones, now a discernible noise, the low, guttural, rhythmic chanting of many voices. They had reached the edge of the great cavern. They had found the buried camp. Crawling on their bellies through the final, suffocatingly narrow passage, the four men emerged onto a high, narrow ledge, the cold, hard stone pressing into them as they peered down into a scene of such profound and calculated horror that it threatened to unhinge their sanity. The cavern was just as Enoch and Caleb had described it, a subterranean cathedral of impossible scale, its ceiling lost in a gloom that their eyes could not penetrate. But the torchlight that flickered far below did not illuminate a simple geological marvel. It revealed a living, breathing circle of hell, a place where humanity had been stripped of its meaning and repurposed for some ancient, malevolent design. The buried camp was real. Spread across the cavern floor was a primitive, sprawling village of crude, black stone huts that seemed to have grown organically from the rock, their low, dark doorways like gaping mouths. In the center of this nightmare settlement, dominating the landscape and drawing all light and attention to itself, stood the altar. It was a single, monolithic slab of what looked like obsidian or polished coal, a gargantuan, unnatural tooth jutting from the floor of the earth, its surface slick and dark, seeming to drink the flickering torchlight and give nothing back. The low, guttural chanting they had heard was emanating from a procession of the pale inhabitants who were circling the monolith in a slow, hypnotic shuffle, their long, white limbs moving in eerie unison, their blank, expressionless faces turned toward the black stone. They were a people born of darkness, a feral, inbred offshoot of the Blackwood clan who had, over generations, adapted to this lightless world, their skin losing all pigment, their eyes becoming large, dark pools, their bodies elongating into a form that was both disturbingly graceful and profoundly unnatural. But it was not the inhabitants, nor the scale of the cavern that seized Arthur's soul with a fist of ice. It was the tableau arranged around the base of the great altar. It was the 81. They were not buried under 1,000,000 tons of rock and soil as the world believed. They were here, laid out in a complex and horrifyingly deliberate pattern, a macabre spiral that radiated outward from the monolith. They had not been crushed in a collapse. They had been butchered. It was a scene of ritualistic slaughter, a harvest of flesh and bone. Their bodies, pale and bloodless, had been systematically dismembered and reassembled into grotesque effigies, their limbs intertwined with those of their comrades, their heads placed upon stakes, their empty eyes staring up into the eternal darkness of the cavern's ceiling. Their mining tools, the pickaxes and shovels that had been their livelihoods, were now instruments of their desecration, arranged in geometric patterns between the bodies, a horrific parody of a job well done. There was a sickening order to the chaos, a chillingly artistic intent to the carnage that spoke not of frenzied violence, but of cold, patient, and reverent work. This was not a mass grave. It was a shrine. It was the tithe, laid out for the ancient god of the deep earth to see. The air was thick and heavy, laden with the coppery stench of blood and the cloying, sweet smell of opened viscera, a miasma of death that coated the back of the throat and made the eyes water. From their high vantage point, the four men watched in frozen, silent horror. The world of logic, of government reports, and geological surveys had ceased to exist. This was a place of primal fear, a window into a reality governed by older, darker laws. Elias Vance, the disgraced surveyor, was muttering under his breath, not in fear, but in a kind of horrified, professional awe. "The geometry," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It's all aligned. The bodies, the tools, they form a sigil. It's a map of some kind, a prayer made of flesh." He saw not just a massacre, but a design, a horrifying equation presented to an unseen power. Beside Arthur, Caleb let out a choked, guttural sob, a sound of such profound grief and rage that it seemed to tear its way out of his throat. He had recognized one of the faces on a stake, the ruddy, bearded face of his own brother, now a pale, empty mask in the torchlight. The sound, though small in the cavern's vastness, was enough. Down below, the chanting stopped. The procession of pale figures froze. And then, as one, with a chilling, insect-like synchronicity, every head in the buried camp snapped upward, their large, dark eyes fixing on the ledge where the four men lay hidden. There was no shout of alarm, no cry of anger. There was only a sudden, predatory stillness, a collective focusing of intent that was more terrifying than any war cry. The silence that fell was absolute, a crushing weight that seemed to suck the very air from Arthur's lungs. He knew, with a certainty that transcended thought, that they had not simply been discovered, they had been anticipated. Their intrusion was not a surprise, it was a part of the ritual. The pale figures began to move, detaching from their silent formation around the altar and flowing toward the cavern walls with a silent, unnatural speed. They moved on all fours, their long limbs carrying them across the rocky ground like enormous white spiders, their movements fluid and impossibly fast. They began to ascend the sheer rock face, their long fingers and toes finding purchase on surfaces that should have been unclimbable. The hunt had begun. "We have to go," Arthur hissed, his voice cracking, the spell of horrified paralysis broken by the imminent, climbing threat. He grabbed Caleb, who was still frozen, his eyes locked on the face of his dead brother, and dragged him back into the narrow passage. Enoch, his face a mask of grim resolve, was already scrambling back the way they came, his earlier terror replaced by a cold, hard purpose. Elias, the last to retreat, took one final look back at the scene, his surveyor's mind desperately trying to commit the horrific geometry to memory, to burn the proof into his brain before he turned and followed the others into the suffocating darkness of the tunnels. They plunged back into the labyrinth, no longer cautious explorers, but panicked prey. The oppressive silence of the tunnels was gone, replaced by the frantic, echoing sounds of their own ragged breaths and the scrape of their boots on the stone. And behind them, a new sound began to fill the darkness, a soft, dry, skittering noise, the sound of long, pale limbs on rock, a sound that was getting closer. They were being pursued by things that were born of this darkness, things that knew its every twist and turn, things that did not need light to see. The hunters had become the hunted, and the throat of the mountain, their secret path to the truth, was now a trap, a long, dark gullet that was closing around them. Their lanterns cast wild, dancing shadows on the walls, turning the strange alien sigils into a writhing, mocking audience to their flight. The low, resonant hum they had felt earlier returned, louder now, a deep, angry thrumming that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountain. It was the sound of a great and terrible thing, a sleeping god that had been disturbed, its slumber interrupted by the insignificant sacrilege of their presence. Arthur's mind, reeling from the horror of the cavern, focused on a single, terrible realization. The 81 miners were not the end. They were just the most recent payment in a long and bloody account. The entity that dwelt here, the ancient power to which the Blackwood clan and their subterranean offshoots paid their tithe, was not a myth or a superstition. It was real, and it was hungry. The skittering sounds grew closer, a dry, multi-limbed clicking that echoed through the labyrinthine tunnels and scraped at the edges of their fraying nerves, a sound that was not of the natural world, a sound of bone on rock. The darkness behind them was no longer empty. It was filled with a swift and silent pursuit, a relentless hunting party that knew this subterranean world as intimately as a man knows the lines on his own hand. Their lanterns, their pitiful shields against the absolute black, began to flicker and fail, the oil sloshing and sputtering, casting their flight in a series of frantic, strobe-like images of terror. The wild, desperate eyes of Caleb, the grim, set jaw of Enoch, the sweat-sheened face of Elias as he tried to decipher the deerskin map while running for his life. The very mountain seemed to groan around them, the deep, thrumming vibration escalating into a palpable tremor that shook dust from the ceiling and sent loose stones skittering across the floor. It was the sound of an ancient, slumbering leviathan stirring in its sleep, angered by their trespass. They were in a desperate, panicked race against creatures born of the abyss and the wrath of the earth itself. The pale things were unnaturally fast, their long, spidery limbs carrying them across the uneven ground and up the tunnel walls with a terrifying fluidity. A shadow would detach from the greater darkness, a flash of white skin and long fingers, before they would scramble back, their hearts hammering against their ribs. It was Enoch, the old miner who had already died once in this mountain, who understood the futility of their flight. They were not escaping. They were merely delaying the inevitable. He stopped abruptly at a narrow junction where the main tunnel was supported by rotting, creaking timbers, a section he recognized from his years of working these upper seams. "They know these paths," he rasped, his voice a dry whisper of coal dust and finality. "We can't outrun 'em, but we can close the door." He held up a small, greasy pouch he had carried with him from the cabin, a relic of his trade, a handful of blasting caps and a short fuse. Caleb and Elias stared at him, their faces masks of confusion and horror, but Arthur understood. It was a sacrifice. Enoch's eyes, which had burned with a feverish terror, were now calm, imbued with a terrible, clarifying purpose. He was no longer a haunted survivor. He was a gatekeeper, preparing to seal the mouth of hell. "Get him out," Enoch said, nodding toward Arthur and pushing a small, worn Bible into his hand. "Get the story out. For the 81. For all of them." Caleb screamed in protest, a raw, animal sound of denial, but the skittering was almost upon them. With a strength Arthur didn't know he possessed, he and Elias dragged the grieving, struggling Caleb away down the only clear passage. Looking back, the last thing Arthur saw in the flickering lamplight was the old man, Enoch, calmly setting his charge, his face serene, a ghost finally choosing the terms of his own haunting. The explosion was not a loud, sharp crack, but a deep, gut-wrenching whump that tore through the mountain, the concussion throwing them from their feet. The tunnel behind them collapsed in a deafening roar of splintering timber and shattering rock, sealing the passage and Enoch's tomb forever. The skittering sounds were gone, replaced by a profound, ringing silence. They had been given a chance, bought with the old man's life, but the mountain was not finished with them. The blast had critically destabilized the entire tunnel system. The tremors intensified, and the very air grew thick with dust, making each breath a painful, choking gasp. They scrambled onward through the darkness, Elias now leading with a desperate urgency, knowing their borrowed time was running out. It was a fall of rock, a secondary collapse triggered by the explosion, that took the surveyor. A shower of shale and stone rained down from the ceiling without warning. Elias cried out, a sharp, surprised sound, as a heavy rock crushed his leg, pinning him to the ground. Arthur and Caleb rushed to his side, trying to move the rock, their fingers raw and bleeding as they tore at the stone, but it was no use. Elias Vance, the man who could read the language of the earth, lay broken, his leg shattered beyond repair. He looked up at Arthur, his face pale with shock and pain, but his mind still sharp, still working. The journal, he gasped, pushing Arthur's satchel toward him. My notes, the geometry of the altar. It's a celestial alignment. They aren't just killing them, they're charting something. A star map, made of flesh. His voice trailed off into a pained whisper. Go. The map is in your head now, Arthur. You know the way. Tell them what you saw. Make them believe. Leaving him was the hardest thing Arthur had ever done, a second betrayal that tore at his soul, but Elias's pleas and the groaning of the rock around them left no choice. The final leg of the escape was a blur of grief and terror. Caleb, his mind shattered by the loss of his brother and now the sacrifice of his friends, had fallen into a near catatonic state, and Arthur had to drag him, pull him, and push him through the final, suffocating passages toward the surface. He could feel the cold, fresh air before he could see the light, a faint, sweet draft that promised life. He burst out of the throat of the mountain and collapsed onto the damp earth, gulping in the clean gray light of dawn as if it were water. He had made it. He was alive. He pulled Caleb out after him, but the man's spirit was gone, his eyes vacant, staring back at the mountain that had taken everything from him. Arthur Prescott, his suit in tatters, his body bruised and bleeding, his mind a gallery of unspeakable horrors, was the sole witness. He did not rest. Fueled by a righteous, incandescent rage, he staggered back into Blackbriar Creek, a specter emerging from the woods, with the broken Caleb in tow. He strode directly into the office of the Cumberland Coal Iron Company, past the stunned clerks, and burst into the office of Silas Blackwood, who was sitting with the town's mayor and Dr. Finch, calmly smoking cigars. Arthur slammed his journal onto Blackwood's polished desk, the book's pages stained with dirt, water, and the blood of his fallen comrades. He told them everything. His voice, raw and hoarse, filled the room with the story of the cavern, the pale inhabitants, the ritualistic slaughter of the 81 miners, and the sacrifices of Enoch and Elias. He described the altar, the sigils, the celestial map made of human bodies, his words tumbling out in a torrent of horrified, undeniable truth. When he was finished, gasping for breath, the three men did not react with shock or disbelief. They simply looked at him with an expression of cold, clinical pity. It was a performance, a masterclass in practiced deception. Silas Blackwood slowly shook his head, a look of profound and gentle concern on his face. Arthur, he said, his voice a low, soothing murmur. You've been through a terrible ordeal. The strain, it can play tricks on the mind. Dr. Finch rose and approached Arthur, his eyes filled with a false sympathy. He spoke of geological gases, of pockets of fungus known to cause vivid hallucinations, of the effects of extreme stress and grief on a man unaccustomed to such tragedy. They turned his truth into a diagnosis, his testimony into a symptom. They pointed to the catatonic Caleb as further proof, a man whose mind had clearly snapped under the weight of grief. The story was too monstrous, too fantastic. Who could believe in a subterranean race, in a blood pact, in a history of ritual sacrifice in the modern age of steam and steel. The company wielded its power with surgical precision. They used his own government to discredit him, sending a telegraph to the Department of the Interior detailing the tragic mental breakdown of their inspector. He was officially recalled, his investigation terminated, his name and reputation destroyed. He was no longer Arthur Prescott, government agent. He was a madman, the author of a grotesque and lurid fantasy. In the weeks that followed, the company, citing the unstable geology and the tragic obsession of the disgraced inspector, brought in teams of engineers. Under the guise of public safety, they permanently sealed the Blackbriar Creek mine, dynamiting every known entrance, every ventilation shaft, every fissure in the rock, including the one known as the Throat of the Mountain. They entombed the 81 dead miners, the buried camp, and the unspeakable truth under a final, impenetrable layer of stone and silence. The official report, detailing a tragic but natural collapse, became the accepted history, a neat and tidy tombstone on a century of slaughter. The final chilling truth was a thing Arthur now understood with absolute certainty as he was escorted away in disgrace. Blackwood, Finch, the mayor, they were the surface dwellers of the clan, the respectable, public face of the ancient pact, the modern managers of the bloody tithe. They did not need to believe his story. They had written it. The official story stands. The mine is forever sealed, and the truth lies buried once more, a quiet, festering secret in the heart of the mountain. It leaves one to question, as our own world is built upon foundations we do not always inspect. How many other dark histories lie just beneath our feet, and in the deep and quiet places, what terrible bargains are still being honored?